Welcome back, everybody. It is John Pollock here at Post Wrestling, and very happy to have this individual joining us today. It's very rare that we get any significant insight into the structure of UFC contracts, but this individual, not afraid to turn over some of those rocks and see what's underneath. A pleasure to be joined by John Nash from BloodyElbow.com. John, thanks so much for taking some time to join us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
You have been doing fantastic work throughout the years. I have told you off air, I have been a long admirer of your work, in particular going into and explaining in great detail the antitrust suits that are ongoing against the UFC. But recently you reported on some significant changes to UFC contracts that I think require a pretty big spotlight, because it's very alarming when you look at some of the minor changes and major changes that could come out of it. I wanted to take our viewers back a bit, though, and pre 2017, when you're looking at sort of the state of the typical restrictions on a UFC contract, like how restrictive would you assess these deals to be prior to the introduction of the Sunset Clause and other modifications we've seen over the years?
Yeah, prior to mid 2017 is kind of the stereotypical UFC contract that a lot of people might be familiar with, or at least the idea from like the stories at the time that they're incredibly restrictive. The UFC had a lot of power over their fighters. One is they forced the fighters to give up their video game rights, the famous John Fitch incident. They had their merchandise rights, and they own that stuff in perpetuity. They own the rights to your image rights in perpetuity. They could market it forever. And on top of that, they had all these tolling provisions, which on paper, your contract has a limited amount of time. It's like 5 fights, 20 months, right? So in 20 months, you're supposed to get 5 fights. So the general idea of the public is every 3 fights every year that the UFC has to give you. Now, technically, if they offer that, but that doesn't mean they have to give you those fights. If they don't offer you those fights, it's only when the contract runs out that they have to have some sort of accounting to basically say, why didn't we give you the fights? Do we have to pay you for that? On top of that, there's tons of ways they can extend the fights, extend the contract. For any reason that you can't take a fight, or for any reason they can't give you a fight, basically, they can extend that contract. And so the old contracts could run forever. I mean, people might not aware, Nick Diaz's brother just came back last year to fight Robbie Lawler. His last fight before that was 7 years earlier. Mm-hmm. He's on the same contract he was 8 or 9 years ago at that point. Well, he signed a new contract to fight Robbie Lawler, but he was stuck with the UFC up to that point on the old contract.
It seems that, we saw instances, Jens Pulver just being announced for the Hall of Fame. It takes us back to a time when, he was lightweight champion, left the company. Similar situation with BJ Penn. We had the Randy Couture situation in 2007. And it seems examples like that, it put a spotlight for the UFC of shoring up any of these provisions that could allow such a case to occur. And the result has been, we hold so much power that it has gone in such a far direction that and the fighters have largely just been complacent here, in the sense that they have gone along with all of these changes. And now it is just, they have become so one-sided.
Oh yeah, I mean, I have a writing partner, Jacob Devitt, so we're working on a book together. But he tracks like the changes in contracts over the time, and you can see every time a champion or someone leaves the UFC, they go back and redo the contracts to make them harder to leave. So that doesn't happen again. When BJ Penn leaves, we change the contracts. Randy Couture had there was a loophole he thought in his contract that he could use to get out. After that was done, the contracts he got more stringent and more restrictive. So yeah, every time that happens, they make them more restrictive. And it's based on the fact the UFC has so much power. They have two things. They have one, they have the carrot, they have make more money than anybody else. So the alternative to the exchange for the fighter, like, why would you accept this terrible contract? Well, the alternative to the exchange is a deal that doesn't pay much, because the other promotions, especially during select times in MMA history where the other promotions are gone, that this is really the only option. And so I accept it. So the UFC can keep churning that nozzle, the dial to the right, more and more restrictive with no problem.
So the first antitrust suit comes at the end of 2014. It is still ongoing all these years later. But in the wake of that, what are some of the changes that you start to see in UFC contract language, and when do those changes start to occur?
Well, you start seeing the real big changes happen in 2017. So the first antitrust lawsuit, Kung Lee versus Zuffa, and the other named plaintiffs are Nate Quarry and John Fitch and Kyle Kingsbury and Brandon Vera and Javier Vasquez. Those are the other named plaintiffs. That lawsuit was filed December 16, 2014. So the period starts December 16, 2010, because there's a 4 years statute of limitations for antitrust. So it starts then, and it runs to 2017, June 30th, 2017. So right in the middle of, right around that date, you start seeing changes in these contracts. The changes are they limit how much they can use the tolling provisions. They're no longer the image rights in perpetuity. There's 2 years after your contract's up, you get your image rights back. They have a sunset clause. They don't call it that, but there's a 5-year maximum duration of the contract. So after that period, they have to end. So all these kind of beneficial changes to fighters, they're positives. And then the Cajun Johnson lawsuits filed in 2021. It runs from July 1st, 2017 forward. Well, those changes you can see now divide the two antitrust suits, and so you've split the class. You can no longer, if you have different, if there's a different market environment because of these contract changes, you cannot merge them into one lawsuit. I think that was the intent.
So in effect, this would be those changes would really not affect the first suit and those that would fall under the first class period. This is more so mitigating potential losses from July 1st, 2017 onward with the new class.
Yeah, it does two things for you. One is you split the class. You now can't pool them together for one lawsuit. You got to do it separately. You got to trial them separately. You got to do the evidence separately, so it extends the cost. It makes it less risky for the UFC because you can extend one suit longer and longer. The other thing it does is it mitigates the damages, because now you can claim that we've changed these contracts in some way, that we're not doing these coercive efforts that we did before that you accuse us in the first suit. We're not doing that as much. And so we can't be responsible for as much damages going forward. So you've done two things. You've sealed off that 2010 to 2017 period as a one-time event that you might have to pay for on your balance sheet. And going forward, you might have problems with this current lawsuit or future ones, but not nearly as bad as that earlier one.
When you look at the two suits, and what from your estimation, from studying this as much as you have and going into the nuts and bolts, what would be the ideal outcome for the plaintiffs if they got a realistic outcome of what they could expect to come out of this that is within reason of what you could expect, understanding the landscape of the UFC and MMA as a whole?
Well, I mean, their expectation, I'm sure, is to win, and the most realistic outcome is some sort of settlement. Because if the UFC doesn't settle and it goes into trial and a jury trial, and I know a lot of other media members say, they don't give the plaintiffs much chance because they don't agree with the evidence or whatever. You're going to a jury trial. You're going to sit there and have fighters stand up and the promotion stand up in front of normal people and say, we keep 80% of the revenue and they only get 20%, that they're broken with CTE, these fighters. That is not a situation you want to take a gamble in, because it's very plausible that you could lose that. And if you do, the damages that the experts have come up with is anywhere from $800 million to $1.6 billion just for that first period, 2010 to 2017. And if you lose in an antitrust lawsuit, it treble damages. If you lose by in the trial, treble damage means you triple the damages. So that $800 million to $1.6 billion becomes $2.4 billion to $4.8 billion in damages. So that, in best case scenario for the fighters, obviously, is they go all the way to trial and they clean house. That's why I think if it gets further enough along, if it gets past class cert and we get past the appeal process and we get into trial, you'll see the UFC and both sides settle, because the one side does not want to take the risk of those massive damages. The other side doesn't want to carry the fight on forever and ever and then end up with maybe losing. So there'll be the most realistic outcome, I think, to get to that point, is several $100 million in favor of the fighters. The one thing is they want a remedy. They want a judge to step in and change the contracts, change the UFC behavior. Well, the one problem is, in the last hearing, the plaintiffs have kind of kicked that can down the road, because they said, we don't need to talk about remedies on the Kung Lee case. We will do that in the Johnson case, because we're going to revisit this. And if you're still abusing your powers, then we have to talk remedies. If you're not, then we don't have to talk remedies.
Are you surprised it's even gotten this far that a settlement has not been in the cards yet? Because through discovery and the reporting you have done, like we have had unprecedented knowledge into the financial structure and seeing there in black and white, like what these percentage of revenues being paid out, like what they are.
Yeah, I was a little shocked because I thought at some point there'd be a settlement, but it makes sense in hindsight to think about it because the way it's played out. Because for the UFC, one, they don't want to pay; they don't think they've done anything wrong. Two, the longer it drags out, look at what happens to their revenue. Their revenue is exploding, and keeps growing. They're well past $1 billion now in revenue. Their EBITDA margins are 50%. So if they can wall off that Kung Lee case and say they end up let's say down the road they end up settling and say we have to pay $400 million out to the fighters, that's 1 year of EBITDA now. 1 year off the books. Like we had one bad year, but we've written it off the books. We never have to worry about it again. If they had to settle this for that amount 3, 4, 5 years ago before the ESPN deal, that might have crippled them. Now it's like it's a bump in the road.
How much of an attitude change did you sense among the fighters post sale in 2016? Because it did feel like there was a bit of a light that went off that, prior to the sale to Endeavor, that it still had this feeling of, we are fighting for this company. We are still in this, a lot of fighters that were in that era in the late 90s, early 2000s, when this was the dark days. And suddenly you're seeing these deals that are in the billions, not millions, and suddenly realizing, wow, we are exceptionally underpaid when we are the product.
Yeah, well, actually, there was a radical change amongst the fighters' opinion at that time. I remember I was doing a poll of fighters about what their real purses were, what they really were making, because I was trying to get I was doing a survey trying to figure out exactly what fighters made besides the commission reports. And no one was, I got very few people to get back to me. But the 1-2 punch at first, the Reebok deal, where they got rid of all the sponsors and you had to wear the Reebok uniform. And then the sale, when they realized how much the Fertittas and Dana White, the Zuffa, the owners, were going to get from the UFC, and also saw some of the financials come out and said how much they were making from the UFC, because the story up to then is the UFC was not that profitable or wasn't incredibly profitable. All the money was going back into the promotion kind of. They realized that, you could tell there was a open hostility amongst a lot of fighters. And my survey results, I suddenly got I can't remember what I started with, a dozen fighters were commenting. Within 2 or 3 months, I got 70 or 80 fighters kept sharing details of 200 purses. Unheard of at the time because no one would do that. By a year later, though, that had waned because, the fighters were upset, but then there's such high turnover in MMA. By 2 or 3 years later, you're talking about a whole new crop of fighters that came in that don't have that same feeling about being like, hey, I took one for the team for years. I didn't get any reward from this.
And I think that is sort of that paranoia, that fear that exists in a lot of fighters, in that am I going to be supported by numbers if I put my neck out? And am I going to be risking my career that could be a fraction of what another athlete's career is? Like, I only have a small window to make this money, and I do not have the time to enter a gigantic labor dispute with the UFC. And I think you just have that prevailing that, unfortunately, these fighters are not supported by numbers, that it's few and far between that are willing to go public with these issues, much less take any meaningful action with it.
Yeah, I mean, no, the Dominic Foxworth, who used to be in the NFLPA, NFL player before that, he's commented on. He's done great articles about the what makes the NFL Player Association so weak compared to the other Players Association. And one is such a vast number of players have very short careers. And you think about MMA is much worse. Your peak, there's an Anderson Silva and a GSP that have long careers that at the top. But most fighters, their peak earning potential, the chance when they're at the top, in the top 10, a contender, whatever, might be a couple of years. Any sort of labor dispute, like people are like, oh, the fighters just held out. Well, any sort of labor dispute is going to cripple their potential income. If I'm a bus driver, a city bus driver, we go on strike. Well, I might be out of work for a few months and lose money, but I know my next 20 years of my career, if I got the raise because we striked, I'm going to see that money come back and then some. A fighter, I strike. Well, by the time, we get some sort of benefits from that, my career might be over because it's so short. On top of that, you're easily replaceable. There's nothing that says that we can't swap you up for another another fighter, because like the NFL, even the bottom guys have a importance because you need the best players on your team because you're trying to win. There's nothing that says you need the best fighters on a prelim, so if you step forward, all the UFC has to do is get 20 people to show up every week to hold an event. That's pretty easy to find 20 fighters in the world that'll show up. And then there are a few headliners that'll, will cave into any sort of labor stoppage.
It's also that period that coincides with the sale to Endeavor, while also moving into so much more of a fixed revenue business, whether it is television rights, whether it's the streaming deal. This is not the same industry of 10 years ago where you are living and dying based on what you can sell on pay-per-view each month. You have a guaranteed income. You have, there's still the live event perspective, but it is like, this is so much that one fighter steps out, we can go a year without a Conor McGregor. We can go 3 years without a John Jones. It is, unless you're feeling that pressure point from an ESPN, like this company, it is so much beyond just being privy to one set of fighters that we have to bend over backwards for.
Yeah, you can see in the past, like a handful of fighters were responsible for like a third of the revenue, and that pay-per-view revenues were 70% and non-pay-per-view were 30%. So those pay-per-views were incredibly important. Now, because the ESPN deal and the way everything is paid contractually, at least the vast majority is, there's no variability. So as you point out, individual fighters in the past, maybe a handful of fighters, if they decided we ain't going to fight, it would put pressure on the UFC. If that handful doesn't show up now, it doesn't matter. They're getting the same checks from ESPN as they did before. The same amount of money is coming in, and all they have to do is wait out this current, holdout. I mean, John Jones held out for a couple of years, and it made no dent in their business. The one time that they had leverage probably was right after the sale, because they took on billions of debt on the expectation that EBITDA would skyrocket when they got their next TV deal. But they were at a point where they were at very tight margins and they need as much money as possible. That's the time Conor McGregor got the Mayweather fight. So I don't think that's a coincidence. He had the leverage and they caved in because they needed as much revenue as possible. That era is past because now they've blown past with the new ESPN deal what they were making before. And their revenues and profit margins are so high now that they can, and consistent revenues are so high that they can withstand anybody holding out. They don't need anybody to show up to fight.
So that leads to the natural question. In your estimation, is the idea of just the pipe dream of an association, of a union, is it, like, to me, I can't see how all the parts could come together in such a unique sport like this. Like we cover a lot of professional wrestling. It's very similar in that sense where, I mean, what's so attractive about these companies are the fact that you do not have to have the split of revenue with your talent, with your fighters, as you do other sports leagues, nor the breakdown of sponsorship money that trickles down. I mean, it's a very advantageous business when you throw out any kind of representation for your core product of your fighters and talent.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a chance we could have something like an association. I'm a massively pro-union guy. People follow me on Twitter, they'll realize I'm very pro-union. But I don't see how a union works in MMA just because the way the industry is constructed. Like I just mentioned about all the ability that all the fighters are replaceable. It makes it kind of hard to have some sort of using the powers of a union solidarity to first organize enough fighters to join, but then collectively bargain. First use your strike power. That's going to be useless because everybody can cross the line. So I don't think that's really a realistic solution. An association is possible because we need a lot less people involved. But again, there'd be the fear factor. So I think the solution is going to have to be some outside type of interference, basically by like the courts, as we're seeing the antitrust lawsuit, potentially the Ali Act. Maybe you have a small association, a handful of fighters in the UFC. Or outside the UFC, like Francis Ngannou or whatever, show up to Washington, D.C. and get like the Ali Act passed that could make some changes, what's happening. But you're not going to see the typical NFL PA, and NBPA type of structure where they sit down and negotiate a 50-50 split.
And as well, when you look at just like a Francis Ngannou that is so, like, he just feels like such an outlier in all of this, of somebody that is at the top of the sport and also willing to really stick his neck out in some sorts of this. What specifics from his contract in 2017 were of note, because this seemed to be the first person that greatly benefited from this sunset clause.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it was the sunset clause was the primary thing, is that they had a set limit to the duration of the contract. So by him winning the championship and getting the championship clause, he bought out his contract at the end of last year. At the beginning of last year, January, he fought out his last fight of his contract. So technically, he should be a free agent. His contract's done. But the UFC, they have a championship clause. He won the title. He adds 3 fights onto his contract. 3 fights or 1 year, whatever's earlier. But under the old rules, if he turned down fights, they could extend that contract 6 more months every time. So he would have to fight through 3 more fights to get out of the contract. And that's a very risky proposition. On top of that, the UFC can stretch it out, wait or find times to offer him fights when he's not available, which they've done to other fighters. And so you're talking about, instead of having 1 year left on his contract, could end up doing 2 or 3 years. It could have, burned through the majority of his career. He might not have been able to wait it out. So that sunset clause that they put in to limit damages really is what allowed him to get out of his contract. And he was the first fighter, maybe GSP was the first to take advantage of it, but he's kind of retired. But the first fighter of that period, because it was introduced in 2017 and his kicked in at the end of 2022, 5 years later, he was the first fighter of a group. We might see several others taking advantage of that, but he might also be the last, because we now know that the UFC has changed those contracts and tightened them up again. And I think that's kind of why, is they introduced them to mitigate the damages, but now they're seeing fighters actually take advantage of those. And that's where the risk to the UFC business model is. They're 800-pound gorilla. There's not a real risk. But if a Francis Ngannou leaves, and let's say a John Jones follows suit, it's not the lower tier fighters. It's that John Jones and Francis Ngannou left and held a fight outside the UFC. That's the type of name value and scale of fight that can make money outside the UFC. And even if it sells half as much, if the fighters are keeping 80% of the revenue instead of 20%, like how the UFC model works, that means they got double, triple their pay. And so that's the threat to the UFC I think they saw, is that a handful of fighters could leave the UFC, hold big events outside. We have Nick Diaz leaving. Conor McGregor might fall. Maybe they'll have a match outside the UFC. But there's the chance of that now happening, which puts more pressure on them, that they could see these big fights going elsewhere. And so they're tightening the contracts to prevent that, because that's their big risk.
So, of these changes that you have reported on, number one is the fact that, if you are to sign one of the newer contracts today, the time on your sunset clause, it doesn't start ticking today. We might not book you for 6 months. That's when theoretically 5-year window begins, as well as now the rollovers can, there's no limit to the rollovers, correct?
Yeah, well, the tolling provisions, that we call them tolling provisions, when they can extend your contract because you can't take a fight, you won't take a fight, whatever. And the old rules, they said, if you turn down fights, we can extend it 6 months or to how long it takes to find a new opponent. But when I mean old, I mean from the 2017 until now contracts, but up to 18 months maximum. 18 months is the maximum amount of time we can keep extending your contract if you turn down a fight. But now they got rid of that. So really the maximum is that 5-year duration. It's now up to 5 years. And on top of that, the 5 years, like you said, it starts not when you sign it, but when you get your first fight. And the periods you're suspended don't count. Now, suspensions are they talking about USADA drug suspensions? Are they talking about commission suspensions because you got in a knife fight or you failed a drug test at the athletic commission? Or are they also talking about those medical suspensions you see after every fight? If they count that, it's very easy to see these sunset provisions not being a 5-year period, but being a 6 or 7 year period, maybe 8.
The medical suspensions to me is like that's a huge clarification you would want, because that's pretty standard. That you don't hear about them all that often. But if you're in a big fight, and it's very common that you have these medical suspensions where you're not supposed to be training for a period of time. But if that freezes your deal, and you're talking about a 6-fight deal, those periods add up at the end as well. They can freeze.
Yeah, after every fight, it's not uncommon to hear a 3-month, 6-month medical suspension. Now later they can get it, they can move it down. They can go see the commission and say, "Oh, my doctor cleared me," and then they get it waived. But okay, now you have to go to the UFC, and the UFC can say, "You got a 6-month suspension. We added it to your contract because you're suspended, We go, well, the doctor got it waived. Well, now you have this whole, it's vague enough that you have to go to court to get that settled properly, which is probably the intent. They want it vague enough that it's not clear that if you want to, if you want to, you can contest it, but if you want to contest it, you would have to contest it in front of it, well, no longer in front of a judge. You have to go arbitrate it now.
Yeah, well, that's the next point that they have really protected themselves in this other one, which is that if you have a legal dispute with the company, it is not going through the regular legal means. It would be with an independent arbitrator behind closed doors, and this extends to your inability to join in on a class action suit. A clear response to making sure that there are no more of these.
Yeah, well, in 2018, the Supreme Court ruled the NLRA did not ban class action waivers and arbitration agreements. So thank you, court, for that one. That really helped a lot of workers in America. But workers, they've been putting this into contracts. Now, NFL, PA, NBA, PA, NBPA, I should say, all of them have arbitration. But that's collectively bargained as part of their collective bargaining. Those arbitrations actually go back to the union's form. Basically, they put in arbitration so they could have a way to negotiate conflicts over current contracts. And those arbitration deals, like with the when the Marvin Miller case, after Curt Flood, Marvin Miller went back and they arbitrated the reserve clause. Those were industry-wide arbitrations, right? When the judge settled that with the reserve clause. These arbitration for the UFC fighters here is going to be individual. You go in, the arbitrator makes a judgment. That doesn't set precedent. You got to go back and arbitrate it again. If you're the next guy, you might not even realize that some fighter contested a contract provision, won, and because it's closed doors, you have no idea this has been done. So the arbitration will help keep it secret. And of course, the class action waiver prevents any future class actions, not just future ones. The fighters coming up now, if they sign this this new agreement, they have to sign to say they will not take part in class action, so no class action go forward. But also, except for the Kung Lee class action case that's already ongoing, they cannot participate or be a member if it's class certified, the Johnson case. So if the Cajun Johnson case that's already been filed, if that gets class certified and maybe gets a settlement, wins damages, you as a fighter have signed on to this agreement and maybe have been fighting the UFC since 2018. Whatever damages they got, you don't get. You would have to go into arbitration and basically run that case yourself to try to win some damages.
So if I was a theoretical fighter, and I emphasize theoretical, and you're my manager, John, and I'm seeing this language, how could you possibly be advising me to sign this deal? Like, what is beyond the fact that I don't want to rock the boat with the UFC? Like, this is, to me, it's mind blowing that fighters would be signing away a potential right to what could be an extraordinary level of damages.
Well, the one thing, a lot of managers aren't really managers. They're brokers for the UFC. Their job is to find fighters and get them in the UFC. So they're not going to tell their fighters to go against it because their goal is to find fighters. I mean, they're not negotiating prices and purses for the UFC. They're just getting fighters into the UFC. They offer the fighters negotiating with them because they want an opportunity to get into the UFC, and the manager provides that opportunity. But other managers, actually, there's managers that care about their fighters. And you got to sit there and you really got to weigh it. It's like, what is the alternative to the exchange? For a lot of fighters, your client wants to be in the UFC. That's their dream, their goal. You can't say you can't go to the UFC because it's a crappy deal. If that's all they care about, then you'd probably say, okay, we should sign, even if it's going to suck. The second thing is that for a lot of these fighters, what's the alternative to the exchange? There's not. The UFC still offers a better deal than the alternative. They have 90% of the industry's revenue. All the money's in the UFC, all the prestige in the UFC, all the awareness, all the audience. So getting the UFC is still probably a better deal for them. But there is certain fighters you really would have to weigh it and say, especially fighters at the end of their career, who you have to sit there and go, is it worth signing for a couple fights that don't pay a lot to give up the potential of damages that you could have got or settlement if this case ever wins? And for them, that's something I would really weigh. And also for bigger name fighters that have potential to see more money on the market, do you want to sign something that's going to lock you in so much into the UFC? Those guys. So there's a lot to take into consideration, but it really is. What is the alternative to the exchange?
And I think that is a huge motivating factor for a lot of these fighters. It is their desire to be in the UFC, that you're starting from that position of already giving up a certain amount of leverage when you make it clear that like this is where you want to be, even taking a sacrifice, while also with the knowledge that I think most fighters, they will be in there with the mindset, I will be that 1% that will make it to the top, that will make those millions. That is almost the mindset you need to have ingrained within yourself. When we'll wind this down in a couple of minutes. It's a fascinating look at an area of the industry that I think not a lot of fans truly understand, just the exact restrictions that exist. From your reporting, John, what has sort of been the feedback you have seen from the audience and their appetite for this kind of information in this detail of ones that are curious and others that maybe do not want to know exactly how the clock ticks in the mixed martial arts space?
Well, the people that I interact with are mostly the hardcore fans that are into these sort of financial stuff. So they're all pleased. They want to know more. And I've gotten some feedback and comments from fighters and managers that were happy about it, that they saw this and then I broke it down and stuff. Because for some managers, these are new introductions. They might not have seen them yet. They're not aware. They haven't shown up in their contracts yet. So they like that this has been done. But overall, I've noticed, I think there's not much appeal for these type of stories. The majority of fans don't really care about these stories. This is something that doesn't interest them. Either they're hostile to it because the UFC is their team, or it's just they're too casual fans. What they want to see is people fight. They don't want the nuts and bolts. They're not interested about the contractual rights or the finances. So for the vast majority, in fact, if you look at it, you and the few podcasts are the ones that talked about the story. There hasn't been much follow-up in the other media sites, MMA media sites, if you noticed. I mean, I don't see the other major sites doing follow-up stories about these contract provisions and the changes, what they mean.
Well, and I think you also hit on what is like kind of the secret sauce of the entire thing, is that to an average UFC consumer, they are on the side of the organization in that I want to see Francis Ngannou and John Jones. I don't want to see fighters going off to other companies or being split apart or having purse bids to put together the best fights. Yeah. A lot of fans want to see just everyone under one umbrella. I don't have to concern myself about how these fighters are making money. And the UFC leans on that fact that in the court of public opinion, there's going to be a lot of pro management within the fan base.
Yeah, it's also, to me, it's a sure sign of the direct lineage of MMA from pro wrestling. The idea of the promotion being the entity that delivers to the fans, that the promotion of the team. We saw it when I was a kid. I was an AWA fan. We loved the AWA. We didn't like the WWF when I was a kid. So that or the NWA, we were, they were all right. But still, you had the idea that this is my team, my promotion. And the UFC has done the same thing, where they built up the idea of a promotion, a self-contained universe, and you were a fan of them, kind of like you'd be a fan of the WWE, or you'd be a fan of the Yankees or the Cowboys. So it's an interesting development, because in boxing, I'm a massive boxing fan too, but you don't see it. You have some fan bases that are like big, Matchroom or PBC, but nothing like this. Generally the fans don't care that who's the promoter putting on the fight. In MMA, it's a very big deal who's putting on the fight.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating discussion, John. I've been doing a lot of studying of late of sort of the evolution of the NHL and the NHLPA, and just reading, like, it is not hyperbole to state that where MMA is right now, it's like 1960 in comparison. And at that time, it was still like hockey players were not even given their physical contracts to look over. And it was so much that you play for the love of the game. And it's this idea of these owners withholding, not making transparent at all what they're making. And they're in the dark. And it would be, Gordie Howe, write down what you feel you are worth. And it was this oath to the team that they got through, and then realizing how much money they were being shortchanged. And again, it was just this idea that you don't fight back against the game. And I think a lot of that still exists of fighters, that if they all banded together, they they do not want to destroy this sport. And I think that, as ridiculous as that sounds, I think like that's the kind of tactics that are embedded in some of these fighters.
What's an interesting comparison is when you look at the NHL, that fascinating period when they had the WHA, they had this massive competition, yet
yes.
the wages didn't really skyrocket as much as they should have, partly because the head of the NHL Player Association was working on the behalf of the owners. But you compare that to the NBA, the same period, same revenues in the 70s, player wages skyrocketed because they had people like, I can't remember the guy that ran the NBA Players Association, but they had Oscar Robertson, and they had all these guys, players that were really on the ball about how to use antitrust and how to use competition in the labor force to build their wage share. They were getting 2/3 of the revenue at that time. So I always think that's the fascinating comparison. These two examples that followed similar path, but the obvious split in the 70s.
It's not until 1990 that hockey players' salaries are disclosed publicly. And we're still in that dark age in MMA where it's like you get these fictitious figures that are presented publicly, but like fighters don't even want to disclose what they're making, even though I think that would be a benefit to them if this was all out in the open and you would have bargaining power. You would have comparables to what you are worth versus a fighter of similar stature.
Yeah, disclosure. I mean, after they passed the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act, the General Accounting Office did a survey of it. How is it working? A report, and one of the things is that one of the most important things that the commissions could do is disclosure of purses. And we've seen the last few years that less and less state commissions are disclosing purses because the promotion, namely the UFC, has asked them not to. They've been, and so they've stopped. Even though that's one of the best things you could do is transparency of purses to help fighters, the commissions have stopped doing that.
This has been a tremendous chat, John. I really appreciate you joining us. I want to alert everybody that you can follow all of John's work at bloodyelbow.com and the Hey Not the Face podcast. You can also follow him at Hey Not the Face, the trademark handle of one John Nash. But anything else you want to get out there, John?
No, this was very enjoyable. I appreciate this. Even though it's for me, I'm a little out of it today. So.
Yes, we woke up John at the crack of dawn, but we so appreciate you joining on, and we will. I would definitely love to have you back on. This is only the scratching the surface of a lot of the great work that you do. So thank you so much for the time, John.
Oh, appreciate it. Thank you.